German election is over, as they say in Germany. I think that's a pretty precise description of where we are in Europe at the moment. And since it will take some time for the new German government to be formed, I think it's time also for Think Tank Europa to look into other matters. And we have decided today to look into what sounds like a phrase from a cartoon, CBAM. Well, that's obviously abbreviation of Carbon Border Adjustment Tariff. The reason why we have decided to look into the CBAM is that it's an important piece of the Commission's Fit for 55 package. After all, when the EU wants its domestic companies to decarbonize, it also has to come up with a scheme that avoids production to shifting overseas, and which also makes it more difficult for European companies to compete. And that is exactly the magic that CBAM is supposed to trigger. However, as all of you will know, the devil is in the detail, and there is also a risk that this magic suddenly transforms itself into a mess, or to be more specific, a trade war. Because although other countries such as United States of America, Canada, and Mexico are also considering sort of launching their own version of CBAM, you also have a number of countries such as India and Australia sort of voicing sort of worries about European protectionism. Just a few weeks ago, the new Secretary General of the OECD, Matthias Cormann, suggested that Europe should learn from the digital tax deal. Don't do it alone. Try to see whether we can do it together in an inclusive framework for carbon pricing. Well, that could obviously be a way forward, although one could also ask how long time will that take. But the point here is simple, that how do we strike a balance between the necessity to avoid carbon leakage and the ambition not to add new complications to our already tricky trade relations with outside countries, i.e. outside the European Union. That's the circle that we need to square. And to help us doing that, we have an excellent panel. First of all, we have Susanne Dröge from Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin. A warm welcome to you. Whenever I'm confused about this topic, and that's pretty often, I can assure you, I turn to you, Susanne, because you have published extensively on this issue. And for German sort of speakers and readers among you, I strongly recommend ein CO2-Grenzausgleich für den Green Deal der EU, Funktionen, Fakten und Fallstricke. Our second speaker has a Heimspiel to continue in German, because that's Sven Rode Nielsen. He is Senior Advisor of Think Tank Europa, former Danish ambassador to countries such as Brazil and Canada. And Sven has written a number of articles on the CBAM, and today he will focus upon the WTO angle. How, if at all, can the CBAM become compatible with the WTO rulebook? And our third speaker is a former colleague of mine when I was pro-rector of University of Copenhagen, because at that time, Peter Mølgaard was dean at the Copenhagen Business School. Now you are Dean Peter at the Maastricht University School of Business and Economics. And just as importantly, for this seminar, you are also chair of the Danish Council on Climate Change, called Klimarådet. And for non-Danish participants, and also for Susanne, obviously, what is Klimarådet? Well, if you go on the webpage, which I did last night, and I quote, Klimarådet is an independent body of experts that advises on how the transition to a low-carbon society can be done in a cost-effective manner, so that in future we can live in a Denmark of very low greenhouse gas emissions while maintaining welfare and development, quote unquote. So that's a task. Enough of me, let's get started. And remember, you can ask questions and put your comments in the chat as we go along. But I go now immediately to Berlin. So Susanne, help us out here. What is the CBAM? How could it work? And what are the main sort of Fallstricke that we should look out for? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luke, and good day to everyone in the room. It is a bit of a blind day, so I think, well, I prepared some slides in order to set the stage, and I'm trying to share them now straight away. Yeah, in order to start our discussion on the CBAM, I hope, Luke, can you give me a signal whether or not you can see it right now? Because I got some messages here. Yeah, okay, cool. All right, so yeah, it's an interesting animal what we are talking about today, and I think in order to set the stage, it would really like to start with the context. The context should be clear. It is a more ambitious climate policy by the European Union that had been announced also in the Paris Agreement process as a so-called nationally determined contribution by the EU. And the new target by 2030 is minus 55% emission reductions with respect to 1990, plus climate neutrality by 2050. And in order to get that on the road, there is a so-called Fit for 55 package where the first chunk has been published on the 14th of July with 13 proposals, 8 of which are reform proposals for the existing legislation. And the ETS, the emissions trading scheme, is still the key vehicle to get these emission reductions materialized. So no overhaul or whatever, but adding on with new, going forward with new tools and a mix of the old ones. In the ETS, so far the anti-leakage way forward was to hand out free allowances to those companies that are at risk of carbon leakage, those that are in international competition and have high cost impacts from CO2 pricing. And what we see with the new proposals and already with the legislation for the phase 4 of the ETS was an increase in CO2 prices in the EU system. So now also what we have in the legislation right now is a decrease of this free allocation. So the carbon leakage story is not being ended, but it gets in a new phase. So the definition of carbon leakage in our discussion here is definitely an industry-related one. There are others, but I don't want to go into more detail. It's about operational and investment leakage, so operation taking place in other countries or moving company sites to outside the EU and probably still to deliver to EU market, but circumventing the CO2 price. Leakage was not an issue in the past because the anti-leakage methodology worked quite well. It took out the carbon price signal and thus the cost disadvantages that were faced by some of the most energy-intensive industries. And of course, there's anticipation now that this will end. This kind of situation will go into a situation where there's a higher threat of leakage, also given in the international environment of doing business. And that's the key for leakage as well. Now, prevention can take place behind the border, as I've mentioned, with free allocation. It can take place at the border. That's what we're going to talk about with the CBAM, and there are different ways to do it. You can include importers in the pricing system. You can charge the imported goods as such, like with a duty, a customs duty, or you can rebate the cost upon export. The CBAM is pretty limited. It is limited to import and an extension of the ETS. So there is a notional ETS intended, no customs duty as such per definition, or export rebates, but free allocation, and that's the mix we are heading for, are still in place or are supposed to stay in place for more than 10 years from now. The potentials you asked about, Lika. I think the point is really that it is a new tool. And first and foremost, it is an add-on to the existing toolbox. Whether or not that is good is going to be seen. Actually, it is a new way, or not a new way. It is a way that had been discussed since 2007 in the EU in order to address specific forms of carbon leakage. And my most favorite example is clinker imports to the EU. While the cement industry got free allowances, they still split their production process into the part that's being imported, sea-based imports in ports, where it was cheap to import the clinker from Northern Africa, for instance, and not paying for its CO2 content. That is carbon leakage for sure, but still cashing in free allowances, not a good thing to do, but look at the scale, look at the policy. And so this was not addressed, and that was raising the attention to, address the import side of this story. Now the story is that a CBAM could potentially substitute free allowances in a long run, which is interesting because it's getting really tedious if you have a highly, a product with a long value chain and not only a simple clinker that is being cracked outside the EU. So the question is it effective against leakage? Can it be? How will it prove to be effective? And that, of course, needs a lot of data and information, and you need to know more about the cost structures of companies. You know that companies can also rearrange their portfolios and their production according to what the costs are. We have a long-standing debate on wage differentials, transport costs, and what have you. So it's not really clear how effective a CBAM can be, and we will see after a while whether or not it will. The WTO compatibility hinges on the design, and there should be no double pricing, that's for sure, for the foreign products. That should be ruled out. And of course, the revenue recycle is a critical point. If you use the revenues generated from a tool that, best of all cases, would eliminate itself, you get into trouble with these revenues because they always raise political interest in keeping up the revenue flow. So I think the political leverage is another key point here, because the CBAM has not been part of a foreign policy agenda yet. It is being used as a foreign policy tool, though. So the signals vis-à-vis China and other critical trade partners are that the EU would like to move forward with its climate policy and will do something about imports that are undermining the agenda one way or the other, maybe through carbon leakage. And that is interesting, because usually we would say it's a technical thing to address leakage, but then you have political leverage attached to it as well. That makes it very interesting, and partly it was already successful in raising the attention. What are the pitfalls? Well, they come along with what I've just said about the potentials, of course. We have legal concerns. Free allocation is supposed to stay until 2035 if the proposal is being agreed to, and that would mean there is a risk of double compensation in one way or the other, and subsidy definition in WTO are pretty strict, especially when it comes to retaliation, to countervailing action. And I don't want to preempt on the next speaker, but this is not being addressed at the moment, and there's a risk. The other risk is the legality as such, because the ETS is not an indirect tax. The carbon price we have is the price that's generated in the carbon market. So that is not a defined indirect tax for which you could do about a tax adjustment. So if you could do about a tax adjustment, like for VAT, you would be pretty safe under the rules. Data availability, ex ante, and the effectiveness proof of the tool is another issue, and it is a risk that this is not legally safe enough, so that you can prove the measure is really working well in what it is supposed to achieve. And if you do a review, you really need to have the right data in place that can be accessed transparently by all trade partners in order to take out the, the speed or the dynamics of retaliatory and other stress. And the revenue recycling, as I've mentioned, is not yet tagged for climate purposes only indirectly, because in 2020 in summer the European Council decided that it is part of own resources for the Commission and the EU, instead of being a resource that is labeled or earmarked for climate purposes. Indirectly, of course, we have a certain share of climate investment in the green recovery or in the pandemic recovery agenda. But well, this is obviously not enough to safeguard it also in under WTO rule, where exemptions for such a measure also need to be proven in terms of what is the money being used for. And what I said before holds again, that if this dries up, this flow of revenues, because this functions, the tool functions after all, you got a problem when it comes to political economy or revenue, let's say claims made by political parties on that. And last but not least, the reactions by trade partners are tricky and need to be addressed specifically when it comes to equity issues. There's no exemption for these development countries yet. Maybe that will come. We don't know. And of course, last but not least, from an environmental point of view, we see that some reshuffling, that means directing, for instance, some of the greener resources into exported goods by trade partners of the EU, or the greenwashing of the CO2 content, the data, is a risk. So we don't know how that's going to be addressed, but I think also that the best idea of the CBAM is to have a phase of 2 years to check on the data availability, to verify the data, and that needs to be hooked, in my perspective, to international agreement on how transparent data can be provided. So I'll stop here. I have more details on the CBAM, blah, blah. I can come to that later on. So I thank you first and foremost for your attention at the moment.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Susanne, for a very clear presentation, also pointing out on the various pitfalls. We'll return to some of them, I'm sure, but obviously also a bit on sort of what are the chances for member states to agree upon this. But before we get to that topic, let's turn to Svend Rode Nielsen, Senior Advisor at Think Tank Europa, because Susanne also mentioned the WTO. There is a challenge there to create a CBAM, which is actually WTO compatible. And that is one of the topics that you've been focused on. So the floor is yours, Svend. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I will try to give a picture of what EU will be up against when this is introduced. What will be the reaction from the outside world? Until now, we have only, should say, general and more principled remarks, preliminary remarks from the third world countries. Why is that? Well, we don't have the final proposal. We only have it on the table. It still has to go through the Council. It has to go through the European Parliament. And after that, there will be a kind of trial period from 23 to 25, where there will be no financial complications or implications. It will only be a phase where we will see, can this work from an administrative point of view? And then a gradual phasing in from 26 and the next 10 years. So there will be time for the outside world to have a dialogue with EU, and a dialogue is needed, because what we have seen until now have been, say, skeptical to negative remarks from the outside world. If we turn to the most important partner, hopefully a partner, US, Kerry has been out saying that CBAM should only be the last resort. Others have said that it looks very complicated. So the signals have been hesitant, but negative from some of the players. At the same time, the Democrats in the Congress had put forward a proposal for US own CBAM, and they will one day, if they really have a developed climate policy, US will themselves need some protection for their industries in one way or the other. So until now, US have sent different signals, and the consequence of this different views have been that they have been rather low-key and hesitant. What EU has hoped for was to have a really strong partner, so that we could go forcefully out to those countries that we know are very strongly against it and roll them over. I would guess that at least for the initial phase, for the starting years, EU will be very much on its own. US will play a cautious, low-key role, and not really going in and being a partner for EU. Look, you mentioned the OECD proposal, and this could be a nice way of derailing the EU process and saying, listen, guys, in EU, you have to wait with your CBAM until we at least have discussed the best solution of all, that we reach a common global carbon emission price. Everybody agrees on that, but it will be extremely difficult and at least very time consuming. And EU would be very reluctant, and I would say negative, to stop their process and wait for a long-term discussion in OECD. Then some of the countries that we know will be strongly against it. The first group I will take is what we call the basic countries: Brazil, South Africa, India, China. Outside countries will look very much on what do we have of export interest. And they start looking at the 5 products that are covered in the starting phase: aluminium, steel, cement, electricity, and fertilizers. But they cover only 5% of EU's import. And I think a number of countries know, okay, if EU succeed on those 5 products, then they will take in more and more products. So even though those countries here immediately will feel the pain, many other countries will later on also fear that their export will be covered. So from a number of, you say, key exporters of products with high climate content, they will stay negative against it. And the most negative, I think, will be the least developed countries. Well, all developing countries will say, we do have a very nice principle which says that you have a common but differentiated treatment, which basically means that the developing countries are off the hook. So fine with all you OECD countries to go ahead, but we use the principle of derogation for developing countries. And then we will have to see, is it possible to divide the developing countries and say the least developed countries, their EU can be generous and open for an exemption for all their export, but for the more developed countries, and in particular a country like China, with a heavy pollution, they have to be covered by the CBAM system. It sounds logical, good that you make this division, but it goes into the whole difficult debate in WTO, where exactly the same issue is one of the key issues when we look at the reform of the WTO. So is it likely that we on the CBAM proposal can solve that huge global question on who should be exempted and who should not be exempted? Again, it will take time, it will be very difficult, but some concession has to be given by EU on that issue. Now, the scene for the discussion will be both bilateral, and I hope that EU will be very active in the bilateral contact, but the fighting scene will be WTO. And there, the overall reaction from the outside world is that this is an unfair discrimination of our export to your EU market. So EU has to prove that this is non-discriminatory between domestic and foreign suppliers, and it is non-discriminatory between foreign suppliers. Domestic and foreign suppliers. On the face of it, we are introducing a system that treats our companies exactly the same way as companies from the outside world. So should there be any problems there? Yes, because the outside world will say, whatever you call it, this is the new duty, this is the new tariff. It looks like it have the same financial consequences, and therefore we define it as a new duty, a new tariff, and it could result with the high emission prices now, it could result in a situation where you will actually have a levy, a tariff on our export above the bound ceiling in WTO. This is unheard. This is the basic principle in WTO, that what we have agreed of ceilings are respected. And here you just introduce a new thing, and then you think you can get away with exceeding the ceilings. Also on the ETS free allowances, clearly you cannot have both. And some have argued that we should keep that. It will be phased out, and in the Commission proposal, I think it is at least said that we will not have a double protection. We will gradually phase out the ETS and then gradually introduce the CBAM for those products. Then discrimination between foreign suppliers. Until now, a like product is defined as the product at the end of the production process. With the CBAM, we are introducing a process. So what is a like product? We would say that we are allowed to have this because of the climate consequences of it, but others would say that you are violating the process or the principle of not discrimination between foreign suppliers. So what is the likely outcome of all this? I think there is a serious risk that there will be a complaint by one of more of the third countries. That will go to the panel, and if the court is reinstated, to the final dispute settlement decision within WTO. And some also legal people will say this is a new thing and we really need to have a final legal decision on that. Again, this will take years and years to have such a decision. EU can also just move ahead, and then the others will most likely introduce some measures against the EU, and then we have the start of what could develop into a trade war. So how could we avoid that? Well, I think it is important what will happen on the COP26. If a big number of countries there really move towards introducing climate taxes or other measures similar to what EU is proposing, I think that WTO have to realize that they cannot block a climate development that the world really needs by traditional legal arguments. And that is, I think, the most likely scenario if we succeed on the COP26, and if we succeed in having maybe some of the starting trade disputes at least kept at a relatively low level. And there we can hope that at least in that respect, we will have the support of the United States, that they will not like to see this developing into a serious trade war. But I think it links into the reform of the WTO. You have to recognize that trade has a minor role compared now to the climate interest. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sven. I was beginning to think that the devil is in detail is an understatement here. Goodness, this is definitely complicated. But there's help around the corner because Peter Mølgaard is on this call as well. And as I mentioned earlier, Peter, you advise the Danish government, the Danish parliament, and the rest of us with regards to climate policy. What is your advice then for Europe, but also for Denmark? Over to you, Peter. Is this Denmark or is this Maastricht?
This is Maastricht. So speaking to you from the cradle of Europe, I would say.
Excellent. And thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. And what I'll do is to proceed in 3 steps. So I'll take the devil out by going very global and very theoretical first. Say, what is it that we want to achieve with a system like CBAM? And then I'll say, what is it that we want to achieve with the Danish climate policy? And then I'll end up by arguing that CBAM and Fit for 55 is actually quite good for what we want to achieve for Denmark. So that would be my approach in those 3 steps. So here we go. Theoretically, a global taxation of greenhouse gases that would accurately reflect the cost of pollution would be the first best solution, of course. If you had a global taxation, that would mean that the externality would be priced correctly and would thus be internalized. And that would mean that the producers around the world would have to pay for the damage that they do to the planet. Of course, the implementation of such a global greenhouse gas tax would require any number of conditions to be fulfilled. We would, A, have to accurately assess the actual greenhouse gas emissions from any production at any geographical location of the world. B, we would have to, we would need the fiscal authorities to collect the taxes and trust in them. C, we would have to get to an agreement of this globally. And I'm sure you can think of others. And I think actually we have already seen Susanne and Sven come up with challenging these basic assumptions and conditions that would have to be met for global greenhouse tax. And of course, the global greenhouse gas tax would be the economist's dream, and it would lead to a level playing field for competition across the globe. And at the same time, it would lead to incentives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions because a producer with lower emissions would have to get to pay a lower tax and therefore be able to sell more. Now, we are living in an imperfect world where it's not immediately clear that we can implement the global greenhouse gas tax or global cap and trade system, which would have similar properties on the assumption that the cap on greenhouse gases would be set to match the correct price on carbon. So this now takes us to the realm of second best solutions. And a carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, is such a second best solution that would address the fact that there is not a level playing field, which leads to the problem of carbon leakage. But before I get to CBAM at the EU level, let me tell you what we're trying to achieve in Denmark and what the recommendations of the Danish Council on Climate Change are. So building on the recommendations from the Danish Council on Climate Change, Denmark got a new Climate Act in 2020. According to this new act, Denmark is to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions domestically by 70% by 2030 compared with 1990 and get to net zero in 2050 at the latest. Now, since then, we have also established a target for 2025 of 50 to 54%. To achieve these ambitious targets, the Danish Council on Climate Change has recommended the introduction of a greenhouse gas in Denmark that would be the same across all industries. We also recommended other initiatives, but let me focus on the greenhouse gas tax today. We suggested that this greenhouse gas tax be phased in from a level that very roughly would correspond to today's ETS price, and then would increase to a level of around 200 euros per ton CO2 equivalents in 2030. That's a high price. We established that level 200 euros per ton CO2 equivalents as an estimate of what the marginal reduction of emissions would cost in 2030. And so note that for companies that would already pay the ETS price, we would of course subtract that from their greenhouse gas taxes so they would not be taxed twice. Nonetheless, a unilateral Danish greenhouse gas tax would of course run the risk of making Danish companies uncompetitive, which would lead to carbon leakage out of Denmark. Companies abroad would not have to pay the tax and so would increase market share. Or Danish companies might want to relocate their production to countries that would not have to pay this tax. Either way, there would be carbon leakage. The result of the tax would be that production and emissions would just happen elsewhere and nothing or little would be gained in terms of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions or the limiting of global warming for that matter. For a small open member state such as Denmark, this leakage problem has to be taken seriously. But of course, the leakage problem is unevenly distributed across industries, with some industries subject to fierce international competition and others essentially shielded from competition. So greenhouse gas leakage is a matter of degrees. And to deal with this leakage problem, the Danish Council on Climate Change recommended a system of deduction in the taxation of the Danish producers combined with a levy on the consumer prices of the corresponding goods. So that would be a levy that would pertain to both domestic and international suppliers to the Danish market. Now, this system might come with some reservations regarding compatibility with EU rules on state aid, but let me leave these aside for now. And then getting back to Fit for 55 and CBAM, it is clear that for Denmark, the problem of greenhouse gas leakage is reduced if the surrounding world, and in particular Denmark's main trading partners, have similarly ambitious climate targets. And they also have increasing prices on greenhouse gas emissions. So Fit for 55 already establishes a more ambitious target for 2030, for Europe than before, and the revision of the trading system will almost surely lead to higher ETS prices. Now, these two features in and of itself reduce the leakage problem seen from a Danish perspective. And the climate border adjustment mechanism also helps by addressing the leakage problem at the European border. CBAM sends a signal to non-EU countries. If you put a price on carbon or in other ways implement binding CO2 reduction targets, then you can sell your products to the EU without paying the border adjustment price or by paying a lower border price, but not if you have to pay sorry, I lost it there. Anyway, the point is that CBAM provides an incentive for other countries, for example, China, to put a price on carbon, as we also heard Sven say. And in this way, they get to keep the revenue in China instead of paying it to the EU. As I mentioned in the introduction, we hope that eventually all major economies will implement stringent climate regulation and reducing the need for the CBAM in the long run. And of course, COP26 could contribute to that. I remain hopeful. I don't know how we're doing with time, Luca. I have a few things to wrap up.
You're fine. Please go ahead.
Okay. So it's difficult to judge what concrete implementations the CBAM proposal will have for Denmark, because it depends on the whole package and how it will end up looking. And it also depends on what would happen in other sectors, so in transport, buildings, and agriculture. It would depend on how the EU carbon price will develop and much more. But nevertheless, in a Danish context, the CBAM will reduce leakage for Danish industries that primarily sell their products on the EU market, as it protects them from leakage out of the EU. In that way, it would reduce the need for a separate Danish measures to reduce carbon leakage if we put the CO2 tax on Danish greenhouse gases across all sectors, as recommended by the Danish Council on Climate Change. And I have a few things to add about the particulars of CBAM, but I think that we could leave that for the Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Peter, and also for sort of really highlighting sort of the implications for Denmark as such. We have a number of questions already coming in here in the chat, so just keep on writing them. I'll obviously make sure that you get that your questions are raised. But before we get to the ones in the chat, I obviously thought I would just come with a few from my side. I mean, to be very frank, after having listened to these three excellent presentations, there seems to be sort of an elephant, not in the room, but in our webinar here, so to speak. Is it really worth it? I mean, to pursue this overall project of a CBAM? Because I mean, Sven mentioned sort of briefly that, well, at the moment, was it 5% of the EU's imports that could be part of this present proposal of the CBAM? Correct me if I'm wrong there. It seems very complicated. We may risk sort of getting countries sort of really countries that are really against this, United States. You also mentioned sort of the least developed world. So is it really worth it pursuing this? What's your take with regards to that, Susanne? That would be my first question to you. Secondly, I was also wondering if some of you could say a few words about the sort of internal negotiation within the European Union. Who's sort of really pushing for this? Do you already see there sort of some countries that will really be very active, or do you see countries that basically say, well, this is going to be too complicated? So these were my two first questions. I think I'll go to Susanne first, and then I'll also check up on the questions that I received in the meantime. So Susanne, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Luca. My perspective on this tool has not changed since I started working on it, and that was in 2007. Oh, it's already 15 years by now. So the point really is that imagine the best of all worlds, where we have a system that is very close to the value-added tax system we have in most countries that are trying to balance and use one principle, the destination country principle, in pricing consumer goods. That would be the best of all worlds, where we should end up with CO2 pricing, because then at the border you would simply just allow for adjustments, and that are along this mentioned principle that each country can do about CO2 content what they would like to see happening. And that is embedded in the Paris Agreement, blah, blah. So we are not there yet. And I think given this kind of vision that there would be a more transparent internalization of the CO2 costs that really occur through climate change, I think we need this kind of vision how to get to a better taxation and also pricing system. And that is allowing still some leeway and flexibility for national policy making. Otherwise, we will never end up in this global solution. We know that, and well, that's where we are. So I think this test the EU is running now with a long plan over the time, next 12 years, is worthwhile trying. While we would probably see it being a stranded exercise, it is still triggering some kind of train of thought we have had in academia for quite a while. Then I think it's an important data exercise, because the next 2 years it is about collecting actual data along some principles that are laid out in the proposal. So it's not a foreign country that is primarily in charge of delivering them, while it has a role to play, but it is the importing companies that have to register with a yet to be established authority. And there they have to reveal what are their imports and how is the content they import from different countries. So it's really tedious, but obviously we need to learn more about the actual carbon flows. We have rough data around the globe, no problem. But the verification is really a really important exercise, also with a view to what we want to establish when it comes to CO2 pricing via the Paris Agreement, because there we want to have more emissions trading, but pricing CO2 can only work if you know what the base is, your tax base is. So, and then another point is, of course, political. It's not only the leverage the EU is creating simply by talking about the CBAM. It's also about the credibility of being a leader, because if the EU has to do it alone, which is really the prospect I share with Sven, which is really tricky, because you cannot do it without the US in the long run, I think. But still, it's trying to establish something alone that delivers on the Paris Agreement. Seriously reducing emissions in our territory and not delivering by, letting companies source out what they produce, and so just producing leakage. So the credibility issue really matters, and the CBAM is one way to establish this credibility, also in the spirit of the Paris Agreement, that industrialized historic polluters need to go first. So that's a paradox with the common but differentiated responsibilities here, and I think burdening the LDCs in poor countries is not a good idea. So this needs to be sorted out. And the CBAM is just another trigger to get this sorted out. And it's a clear example where you can start talking about these effects. Talk about what is the targeted support for these countries in order to establish cleaner production. And then this will pay at the border if they are producing and investing cleaner, which they ask for, right? So it's not like the EU is going to countries and say, here, take our stuff, but rather in the negotiation, we see a lot of demand for technologies and transfers. So this could be more targeted more. So I'm trying to be the person who, the good cop, making a point that it's a good idea to follow up on what we've started. Whether or not we will end up with a CBAM is a totally different question. That's not my answer to that question.
Oops, I think I just lost you there.
Someone muted me. It wasn't me, but I'm done. I'm done.
You're done. What about the internal situation within the European Union? Could you say a few words on that as well? And thank you very much. I think you did an excellent job as a good cop. It convinced me.
Well, internal situation is mixed. We had some buy-in already through the sectors that were included. Poland was bought in by covering electricity imports. And I think it's a French project still, and it will depend on the German stance on it. So Germany took some turns already in the past on this. It's not really enthusiastic about the CBAM. The Scandinavians, you can probably better say something about the Scandinavians and other countries, but I think all those where the industry are established that are now covered have an interest in testing it. It's more or less still a critical situation, so I don't want to preempt on decisions here. My observation is it's still a mixed picture.
Thank you very much. And as Peter is saying in the chat, we need a good COP indeed. So and we also need a good COP. I mean COP 26. And that leads me to one of the questions that we have in the chat here by Christine Wigman. The question is basically, is there an impact? Will there be an impact from the CBAM for the EU's negotiation mandate at COP 26? I'm not sure who would like to answer that question. Do you have an idea on that, Peter or Sven? Otherwise, we go to Susanne again. No. What about you? What do you say, Susanne? Is there a link between the COP26 mandate for the European Union and the CBAM?
Technically speaking, the CBAM is not an issue that is in the agenda of the COP because it is hidden in some forum that is about, help me, I just forgot, it's about the unintended collaterals of climate policy making. So trade and climate is still not high on the official agenda, but on the political level, we will see that the Commission and probably France and other member states will try to sort this out, particularly with the G7, so in the US, and with China, and there it will pop up for sure.
Yeah, and I guess as Sven also mentioned, there's also going to be a linkage there with regards to the least developed world. I mean, they're not going to be too happy if we don't have some kind of solution with regards to the CBAM before that. I mean, that's at least an important angle. Or what's your comment there, Sven? What's your take on the COP26 question?
Well, I think that EU needs to have the CBAM proposal on the table. If we don't have that on the table, it would be extremely difficult to keep this high profile on the whole Fit for 55 package. It would ravel aside if there was no protection for our market if the CBAM was taken off the table. So I think for the moment, we need to have it there. Whether it will actually materialize in a final proposal is a different thing. But I think we are in for a more challenging situation when the actual negotiation inside EU starts. One issue that we haven't touched upon is that CBAM gives no protection for European export. This is only protecting our market, and just taking Denmark, which is basically living out of exporting. We have no protection whatsoever on our exporting markets. And even on our importing markets, well, other countries have companies who have maybe a 5% export to Europe and the rest go to internal market or other markets. They could easily subsidize their export to Europe out of the profit they earn on the 95%. So it gives some protection, but it is definitely not giving the full protection. So is that sufficient for the countries in EU to have a system that is not fully protecting us? And in the same line, it's only those 5 products. Isn't it likely that during the negotiation phase in the Council and European Parliament, there will be serious proposals for including more and more and more products? Just take Denmark right now discussing agriculture. Wouldn't we think it would be nice to have some agricultural products also covered by this area here? So I think what we have on the table now of CBAM could most likely, in order to have it through, most likely be a more extensive program than what we see out of the Commission's proposal.
Yeah, well, let's see whether the Danish internal negotiation on agriculture will be done by the COP26, but that was one remark about domestic politics. Susanne, you raised your hand. There's also a question that follows up from this by Jens Jarsbæk, basically asked, by removing the free ETS allocations completely in the CBAM sectors, competitiveness on outside markets outside the EU is reduced considerably. So the question here couldn't that basically lead to more leakage compared to the current system?
Sorry, look, I don't know what the system does. I didn't raise a hand, but probably never mind. I'm happy to take questions anyway.
I'm sure
Can you just repeat the question, because I just tried to get my head around another point which I wanted to make.
Okay, but the question is that basically Jens Jarsbeck asks us here is that we remove the free ETS allocations completely in the CBAM sectors, and through that we have competitiveness on markets outside the EU is reduced considerably. So couldn't this lead to a situation where we actually have more leakage compared to the current system, is this question?
Sure, that's exactly at the bottom of this discussion, because especially some of the steel, for instance, steel, which is covered by the CBAM or is supposed to be covered, is something that enters value chains that relate to exports from the EU again. And then, of course, the leakage has the other way of leakage is, of course, that competition in third markets, the EU will lose out, and dirtier products which are cheaper will win. I think that is the fight behind the free allocation, which we will now see continuing in the discussion of the proposal. And to me, it seems that we're still on a learning curve here, because export rebates are such a tricky thing to justify under the WTO and will raise immediate countervailing action. This risk won't be taken, while at the same time, there is the idea, at least in this package, to support these industries in many ways to become greener in the EU, and in order to support by subsidization of pilot products by specific technologies like hydrogen, as you've heard. The idea behind it is to bring down the cost as soon as possible, so that export competition is based on the price. Well, we also have quality competition, as you may know, right? So the further down the value chain, the more specific the products are produced with, let's stick to steel, the harder it is to substitute them by, let's be very blunt, by a cheap Chinese substitute. So I think the kind of competition matters. It can become more complex. It's not that simple that you can easily substitute in the foreign markets. And then it matters, of course, how much the markup will be. So how much more we have exchange rate, we have inflation, other things determine the final price, sales prices abroad. So I think this needs to be sorted out. There needs to be more information about the export side of leakage, and we are not there yet. So testing the ground is part of this phase out of allowances, free allowances, and phasing of the CBAM. I am still doubtful that it will work that way, but I think this is the only way we can test it, while hoping for other countries to also raise the carbon cost that will materialize in the sales prices, also in the markets where EU producers compete. So, bigger picture, it's not this very simple idea of now the exports will lose out. I think we are in a phase where it's very critical to get partners on board also in doing something. Whether it's regulation or pricing in third markets, it doesn't matter how you raise the ambition.
Can I just follow up on this? Luca, you're muted.
Over to you, Peter.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no, I just wanted to follow up on what Sven and Susanne just said, and say that as we lose the free allowances in the ETS system, the exporters of emission-intensive products will of course be increasingly prone to carbon leakage, as they will face a higher cost of carbon than their competitors outside of Europe. For Denmark, we would think of our one and only cement producer that has a substantial export, for example, of white cement to the US. So that would be indicating the problem from a Danish point of view. I just wanted to add that. So we have it. It's very real also for Denmark.
Excellent. Then we have a question from Morten Østergaard. He basically asked about the timetable. So if this CBAM is supposed to have an effect on reducing Carbon. I mean, what's the timetable here? When would it have to be finalized? After all, if it has to contribute to the Fit for 55 agenda, I guess we are in a bit of a hurry. So what's the take here with regards to the timetable? What's the best case scenario? I know that, well, you mentioned it has to be phased in and so forth, but it has to have an effect. I mean, what's the timetable that you would there have in mind? Sven? Over to you, Sven. Yeah, do you have the floor? You are muted.
Well, to have a financial effect, it will start at the beginning of 2026. Until then, it will be more a trial period to make sure that the whole administration is working reasonably well. And then it will be a phase-in over 10 years with 10% increase every year, and at the same time a gradual phasing out with the same rate of the free ETS for those production where that is in. So it should then be finally agreed within EU, so the trial period could start at the beginning of 2023. So we have, say, 1 year and 3 months to finalize this complicated package here, and good luck for those guys who are working on it.
Let's hope for a very quick new government in Germany, Susanne, because that's going to be that's a pretty sort of ambitious time frame there. We have a question by Torben Hasford. I think that's from a Danish green think tank, Concito. Do you see CBAM as a serious policy play or more as a bargaining chip? And the second part of the question is it not problematic that CBAM has been crippled from the start by, for instance, not allowing exports to be compensated? Who would like to have a go at that one? Peter, you are nodding, so I'll go to Maastricht.
I was just nodding in agreement, I think, but I think to answer the first question, I think, if it was a bargaining chip towards a global agreement on a common greenhouse gas tax, I would be all in favor of that. And I agree with Torben that the it would be good to include also exports in this and see it as a bilateral thing, or not a bilateral thing, but a two-sided thing, and that would be an improvement. And as for just commenting on from a Danish point of view, of course, we would love to see it, as I also said, implemented, CBAM, or ideally, of course, the global agreement on everything, including greenhouse gases taxes. But from a Danish point of view, it would really be great once we have our Danish greenhouse gas taxation in place to have something just a little bit like this, because it really helps with our Danish leakage, and that's my main headache.
And before I go to Susanne, what's your take on the OECD track? Do you agree with Sven there? That's basic. That would derail the overall process. That's not a sort of a track that one should try to pursue.
Sorry, I didn't completely get your question, Luca.
My question was about the OECD.
Yeah.
I was just wondering whether you agree with Sven, because his point was that it's obviously a best case scenario, you could say, to have an OECD solution, but it could actually derail the overall process if everyone has to agree. And seen from a Danish perspective, I presume we are in a bit of a hurry, or what's your take there?
We are in a bit of a hurry from a Danish point of view, yes, and whether it's OECD, WTO, or UN that comes up with I would go for the UN global agreement as the first best, right? That was what I was trying to say, and of course that is an economist dreaming about what could be the real world, but yes, the broader the base for an agreement like this, the better I think it is for Europe and for Denmark.
Good. So it's interesting to hear what economists are dreaming about. So thank you very much for giving an insight into that. Susanne, you raised your hand. Was that by mistake, or do you?
No, not this time.
Oh, good, excellent. Yeah.
No, I wanted to answer to Torben as well. I think the EU Commission and those in charge of bringing up this package were pretty serious about the CBAM as after many years as a way to test ground for addressing leakage. The proposal is totally in the spirit of the internal ETS anti-leakage logic. If you look into it, it is not about foreign policy. It's really weird after the experience of the aviation, not disaster, but the experience with the aviation draft that was in 2012 when international flights were to be covered in the ETS. Internally, again, it was totally logical, and then the Commission was taken by surprise that there was a real diplomatic crash. More than 20 countries meeting in Moscow, discussing how to retaliate against the EU, imagine. So in order to, and this was a bit to my surprise that the proposal is totally in the internal logic of the ETS. You need a new tool, which is, and I would have expected that the CBAM would have been part of the ETS directive reform, not as a separate legislative proposal, but now it is separate, right? And I think it is being used as a bargaining chip by the von der Leyen cabinet, which is useful for some power play to establish that the EU would like to make a point. But if you look at the legal issues, it's really a seriously legislative proposal in order to make the ETS work. So the alternative would have been to do a reset and to discuss whether the EU needs a carbon tax, a decent one. But you need the whole 27 to agree to a new tax, next to impossible at the moment. So, politically also no alternative. So the internal logic is something that really matters to understand why it's been brought forward. And then agriculture, it's the same. Why bring agriculture into something which is agriculture is not covered yet by an ETS? So as long as that is not the case, forget about the CBAM for the agriculture. It's the same lobbying here in Germany, by the way. I find that very interesting. A highly protected sector in international trade, still highly protected, is first to raise its hand when it comes to the CBAM.